Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I am a yoga teacher at the advanced 500-hour level. I'm also an ordained minister, musician, and kirtan artist. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about being sensitive and yet anti-fragile. Before I do that, though, as always, I want to thank the community that makes these talks possible for me to make these talks without a paywall. And that is the community over on Patreon, on my Patreon page. So they contribute monthly, and that allows me to approach this as part of my job, to devote the resources, the time, the energy, the resources to do this. So I want to thank them, and if you'd like to join that community, please check out the links below. All right, so being sensitive and yet anti-fragile. From my perspective, spiritually speaking, and maybe beyond spiritually, maybe just period, sensitivity is a good thing, or it can be a good thing. In general, it's a good thing because I don't think we can necessarily be more sensitive. So if we're not very sensitive, if we're not very aware, if we don't notice things, if we kind of tune things out, maybe there's a way to increase this. But it seems to me that very often this seems to be the way that we're made a lot of times. So people seem to be very often born sensitive. Certain children seem to be more sensitive. Now, I don't know if that means that these children are necessarily somehow pre-cut out or destined for a spiritual life, but I do know that in the work that I do, there seem to be an outsized number of people that match this description who are parts of the communities that I lead and teach. So there are a lot of people who would describe themselves as very sensitive, and their experience is of being more sensitive than most. Okay? So is that a good or bad thing? Well, oftentimes, interestingly, in these people's youth, it's actually seen as a negative thing. And very often, they might be told they're too sensitive. They might be told to suck it up, buttercup, or pull up your bootstraps, or toughen up, or something along these lines. And there's a truth to that, but the way that it's being handled in those instances is not very effective, in my opinion. I match that description as well. So I was extremely sensitive as a child, and I just felt things very deeply, and I noticed a lot of things that were going on around me. And other people might just sort of tune those things out. The old expression, ignorance is bliss, kind of comes to mind here. I don't know that that's true, but it does seem that there might be some truth to it, in that if we're just unaware of things, to some degree, less things bother us. Now, maybe in an ancient setting where survival meant being aware and being sensitive, maybe this individual would have died, but we live in a period where sensitivity may not be that important in terms of survival. Okay, so we can be not sensitive and we'll survive just fine. Whereas if we're sensitive, we might find that this current environment that we live in as humanity, it is overwhelming. It feels like too much a lot of the time. There's too much stimulation, too much information. There's just a lot to deal with. Even in the best of times, maybe even in simpler times, sensitive people still may have struggled. I don't know, but I do know what's going on today, and I know that many people who consider themselves sensitive. They find the world and life overwhelming. So many people like that will experience depression or anxiety or both, along with other problems, maybe addiction, because they learn that substances or pornography or other things, maybe gaming, can dull their sensitivity, dull the pain. Because a lot of what you might experience as a sensitive person is a lot of pain. If we look at the world, you could say that the world seems like it can be a very painful place, a difficult place. So sensitive, it can seem like a negative. Ultimately, I don't think it is, though, especially when we're talking about going inward and learning about ourselves, learning about reality, learning about the world, and learning how to navigate it. I think sensitivity is a real blessing. However, I think there's one other ingredient that we really need for sensitivity to be considered a blessing, and that is being anti-fragile. And this is why when I teach yoga, I teach, you could say, two different kinds of practices or ideas. So some practices are invitations and opportunities to be more vulnerable, to relax, right? To let go, to stop trying to control everything, to stop trying to manage everything, and just trust, right? And this is, you could say, sort of a pro-sensitivity approach. Then other practices I teach require strength, like power yoga. They require strength, they require resilience, they require us to hold space for a lot of discomfort, a lot of sensation. And this is really training in what I would call being anti-fragile. The world, it just is the way that it is. And for a sensitive person, it can feel very overwhelming. It can feel like it's really too much. But it just is how it is. And we can wish and want and hope that it will change, and it may or may not change. But in my lifetime, it hasn't really changed very much. I think humans face struggles always. If not physical struggles like survival, most people who are listening to this talk, you're not worried about survival. And yet for your ancestors, this was a real concern. They were truly concerned about whether they were going to survive. You are concerned, most likely, most of you, are concerned with other things, like happiness and maybe freedom, like these abstract ideas, human rights, or rights of oppressed individuals, or environmental concerns. And I'm not saying these aren't legitimate concerns. I am saying, though, for someone who's trying to survive, those concerns are usually a luxury. And by survive, I mean like if you don't eat, you're going to die. If you don't find shelter, you're going to die from the cold, okay? So you might be thinking, well, I'm just trying to survive as well. This is a struggle, but we have to keep it in context. So for the vast majority of human existence, and for the vast majority of humans, survival, enough food, enough shelter to just make it another day or another week was the main focus, their main concern. So what we find, interestingly, you might have thought, I might have thought, anybody would think, oh, well, if you take away the concern of food and shelter, then people will be happy. No, that doesn't seem to be the case, as we can see in the United States of America. many Americans are discontent, and they have enough food, they have enough shelter, they have enough clean water. So obviously something else is at play here. So back to our topic, what we find is that being sensitive is a good thing. It's like being able to sense when something is off, or somebody is off, or being able to sense that you should maybe engage with someone or not engage with someone, or pursue something or not pursue something. Sensitivity, I think, is again a real plus. But in the environment we're in, and again, maybe always, I honestly don't know, it can be a liability if we are not anti-fragile. Because what we can find is we get overwhelmed very easily. It's a lot of information. If you're sensitive, you tend to take in a lot of information. You tend to feel a lot. And so again, what we find in yoga is there are certain practices that help us relax and be more vulnerable and maybe more sensitive. And then there are practices that help us be anti-fragile. And I'm using that word because I don't want to say tough. What many sensitive people learn to do is they learn to build armor. They learn to cut themselves off from their own sensitivity, their own feelings. Again, they might do this through drugs, alcohol, sarcasm, again, kind of adjusting their personality to a I don't care, maybe even becoming a bully. There are all kinds of ways that people might cope with that sensitivity. But ideally, through yoga, we'd like to get back in touch with that sensitivity and maybe even enhance it. And at the same time, we need to learn to be strong, and truly strong, not walled off, not armored up, not defensive, but strong, being able to hold space for that sensitivity, being able to hold space for experience. One teacher that I worked with used to say, building a strong container. And he was referring mostly to sort of the energetic aspect of yoga practice, but this applies here as well. Building a strong container for different emotions, different sensations, different experiences. And so, again, what we find in yoga is there are certain techniques that help us relax, be more vulnerable, increase our sensitivity, like yin yoga, meditation, yoga nidra. And then there are practices that can help us learn to be strong, like the yoga asanas, the yoga postures, doing energetic work with bandhas and mudras. And even for some people, chanting can be challenging. It can be ecstatic, but if it goes on long enough, you might find yourself getting bored or challenged, and again, you might find yourself at your edge. So my advice is, if you find yourself overwhelmed, sensitive, not able to cope in this world, then investigate, perhaps with a teacher or someone who knows what they're doing, Investigate practices that help you be strong, that help you function in the world without building that layer of armor, without losing your sensitivity. One of my teachers, Paul Grilly, he was the first person who taught me about something that is called monk's disease. And monk's disease is where a monk living in a monastery is meditating for hours and hours every day. Meditation is a practice that tends to increase our sensitivity. And then the monk might be sent into town to buy some goods from the market. And the monk finds themselves overwhelmed in the marketplace. It's too loud, it's too noisy. I don't know if you've ever done a lot of meditation, especially if you've done like a longer retreat, but this is for real. This happens to people. I've had people who've come on my retreats experience this on their way home from the retreat. They're so sensitive and tuned in, and then they walk into a gas station and it's just, there's music playing, there are people talking, it's a very insensitive environment. So this is an example of monk's disease. And so what Paul taught us is the antidote to monk's disease would be something like more yang yoga, more physical activity, more strength building. And so this is a theme that comes up throughout everything that I teach, this idea of balance. And what you can do for yourself is try and determine what is it that you need. Are you needing more sensitivity, more vulnerability, or are you needing more strength, resilience, being anti-fragile? For many, many people, because again, you see this in spiritual communities and with spiritual people who are pursuing spirituality, they become very sensitive and they become very emotional. But sometimes they're not able to function very well in the world. And they are very fragile, right? It's very easy to upset them. And if we look at the model of, say, a Zen master is not really shakeable. A Zen master a lot of times appears to be almost like an unmovable mountain. They sit there with such poise and strength, and they seem completely unmovable. And this is a good example of what I'm talking about, being anti-fragile. I can assure you, having practiced Zen meditation, a Zen meditator, Zen teacher is extremely sensitive, but they are also, in a sense, immovable. They're anti-fragile. And this is a very important thing to be aware of. In my experience as an American yoga teacher and spiritual teacher in America, at least in this country, in the yogic sort of spiritual world that I run in, there's an overemphasis on the sensitivity. And as I said, there's a lot of people who are sensitive who show up in these communities. And very often what I find is what they do is they try and build a community around them that is ultra sensitive and is sort of catered to the way that they like things. And to some degree, this is a mistake because, again, what we're trying to learn to do is bring this sensitivity into the world we actually live in, not to try and create an alternate world. Maybe one day an alternate world will be created by people who are very sensitive and mindful. That's wonderful if we can all get there. But I think it's very important to be able to be strong in the world. And again, that doesn't mean insensitive. It doesn't mean not feeling, just the opposite, really. But what I find, again, is often in spiritual circles, spiritual people, they tend toward the overly sensitive. They tend to not be resilient and anti-fragile. They tend to be very fragile. Again, it can be very easy to offend them. It can be very easy to upset them. It can be very easy to throw them off kilter. And again, as someone who is built that way myself, I think that it is, again, very important to cultivate the other side of it. Yoga and Taoism and these great wisdom traditions, in my experience, are not just about being one thing. They're not just about being sensitive or vulnerable or spiritual, whatever it is that we might think is desirable. It really is about the balance. So allowing ourselves to, at the one hand, cultivate more vulnerability and sensitivity, and at the same time cultivate more strength and resilience. The analogy I could give you is, think of a tree. So in order for a tree to grow up really tall and reach upward and expand upward, which is a sort of a yang energy, the tree needs to put down roots deeper and deeper into the earth so that it can be rooted and strong. So for us, we need to be the same way. I think a lot of people in spirituality, to continue with this metaphor, they want to reach up to heaven. They want to be free. They want to be spiritual. They want to live in a future where everyone loves everyone and everyone respects everyone and everyone is sensitive to everyone's feelings. And it's a very beautiful thing, except that isn't the world that we live in. And so one, they can get very judgmental about other people who aren't like that. And so they think they are being very loving and accepting of everybody, but they're not loving and accepting of people who aren't loving and accepting, which is a contradiction, right? If we need to love everybody and accept everybody, then we need to love people who don't love, and we need to accept people who don't accept. This is a thing that I see a lot with people who consider themselves, again, loving and caring. They will be very judgmental and harsh of people who don't share their values, people who hold other points of view and other values, right? So this is something to definitely be aware of. So while it's great to want to live in the future and to reach up and try and reach for heaven, we also need the roots to ground down and to be here in this world, to be able to function in this world. And again, I don't think that means closing off your heart. Because I think closing off your heart is actually a sign of weakness, to be completely honest with you. What on the outside might look like a really strong person, again, like a bully or somebody like that, this is someone who's actually probably very wounded inwardly, and it is actually probably, they might be very sensitive, but they've just walled themselves off. So true strength is the person who can stay vulnerable, who can hold themselves in a difficult situation without walling themselves or closing themselves off. And this is what I would encourage all of you to do, because in my own life, it has been very, very valuable. As I said, I'm someone who has made this journey without question. I, as a youth, felt things very deeply and was very, very sensitive. And I was told, because I was male and I was a boy, oh, you can't cry, you can't do this, you can't do that. All these wonderful things that our culture tells us about being masculine and male. And I've been on this path a long time, and I feel that I have been able to deepen my sensitivity on the path and at the same time learn to be very resilient. My life has had many, many challenges in it. I'm not saying there aren't people who've had more challenges than me, but I can't say that my life has been particularly easy. I have struggled with many, many things. And yet, despite that, I find that I've experienced deep, deep, deep levels of gratitude, of joy, of bliss, of peace. And these are the things that I always hope to share with you through these talks. So I'd love to hear from you. Let me know your experience with being perhaps sensitive and then also being anti-fragile, being strong at the same time. If you would like to help out, you're on YouTube, you can do that by liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting. And if you'd like to do a little more, check out the links. You can leave a one-time tip on PayPal or Venmo, and you can also become a Patreon member and help be a part of the community that makes these talks possible. Until next time, everyone, namaste and have a beautiful day.